So, I found this image up on the Kamen Rider subreddit, and since I've got nothing better to do, I decided to make a video about it. All thanks go to Mishkaz for inspiring this video. Like in his video, I'm going to have a little thing on the lower left corner of the screen to let you know how confident I am on each topic. Also, I apologize in advance for all the names I'm going to mispronounce. So, without further ado...
What's the next stage?
In true shonen fashion, each main rider and most secondary riders obtain multiple forms as the season goes on. Also, like most shonen media, the later in the story a form appears, the stronger it is. Though some riders' final forms are demonstrably stronger than others.
What's the next stage?
Kamen Rider, and tokusatsu in general, is well known for being made on the cheap. As a result, an actor or actress returning to their role past the requisite crossover movie is kind of a big deal, especially when the actors have previously retired from the character, like Den-O's Takeru Sato. Speaking of crossovers...
What's the next stage?
Crossovers between riders have been a thing ever since the Showa era, but they became more common and cyclical in the later Heisei era. Typically, the cast of each show will have a big crossover in a movie and then later pop up here and there in anniversary seasons like Geo and Decade. There have also been crossovers with other toku, such as Super Sentai, Space Sheriff Gavan, and even Kikaider.
What's the next stage?
Being a multi-billion yen franchise, Kamen Rider has quite a few movies. Whereas crossover movies usually come out in the winter, movies based solely around the cast of the currently running series typically come out in the summer, thus the name Summer Movie. Early in the Heisei era, the summer movies would be alternate universe takes on the series that were either purely out of continuity or weird time travel prequels. Recently, the movies have been in continuity with the shows, they're just kind of hard to fit in without opening up a ton of plot holes.
What's the next stage?
V-cinemas is the Japanese term for direct-to-video movies, though unlike in America, these movies are considered pretty legit films in their own right. Rider V-cinemas typically serve as epilogue stories to the main series, focusing more on the secondary riders. I've seen some people refer to the specials like Beast Rider Squad as V-cinemas, though the Rider Wiki at least considers them their own thing. Ryuki is the 2002 to 2003 season of Rider, and he's my favorite. Ryuki's opening The very deliberate timing of the shot lends itself to memification, and thus edits of it are a common sight in the fandom.
What's the next stage?
In America, most TV seasons run from 13 to 25 episodes, and the same is true of anime. Rider runs from 45 to 50 episodes a season. As you'd expect, this causes most seasons, even the really good ones, to have some pacing problems, and this trope is indicative of that. The final villains will typically get some kind of last-second power-up that makes them just threatening enough to fill a few more episodes. Examples include Kronos from X8 absorbing Video Game God into himself, Evolt from Bill just getting more and more powerful as he went along, and Baron from Gaim transforming into an overlord.
What's the next stage?
Kamen Rider Decade, the 2009 season, has its main character traveling between dimensions to meet the riders from previous seasons. Sort of. These dimensions are referred to as alternate reality worlds, or another rider's world, or just AR worlds. These dimensions, like the old summer movies, are reimaginings of previous seasons. Really odd reimaginings of previous seasons. So, instead of fighting in a battle royale, the Ryuki Riders are now part of the weirdest criminal justice system ever, the Blade Riders are chefs, Kiva's a kid, etc. This approach to returning riders is one of the reasons why Decade is a contentious season.
What's the next stage?
Propo riders have a tendency to be villains, turn good, then die, though not all these steps are followed, and they're not always followed in that order. They also tend to come back to life now.
What's the next stage?
Being a multi-billion yen franchise, Kamen Rider has a bunch of video games, going all the way back to the NES. Most of them are fighting games, but you do have a few outliers, like racing games, platformers, and even an Onimusha-style fixed-camera action game. Since each Rider season lasts like a year, the vast majority of these games are rushed low-budget titles, though they seem pretty alright for what they are.
What's the next stage?
Like most franchises, Kamen Rider has a bunch of art books that show off concept art for the various suits and monsters. There are also these cool little magazines that have high-quality photos of the finished suits and the season's collectible trinkets. They're pretty great.
What's the next stage?
SIC, or Super Imaginative Chogokin, is a line of high-end action figures that gives the riders an edgier, more organic look almost akin to Shin Kamen Rider, which for some reason isn't on this Iceberg.
What's the next stage?
As alluded to at the top of the berg, Rider is made on the cheap, and since the suits themselves are actually fairly expensive, it makes sense that Toei would reuse some older suits or the parts of older suits to make new ones. This isn't usually that big of a deal since the suit parts will be recolored or have stuff placed on top of them to make them look new. Other times, though, you get... The most obvious cases of this are suits for movie characters, stage shows, V-cinemas, and specials, since, unlike in the main show, those suits will only be used once. Oh yeah, Kamen Rider has stage shows, too.
What's the next stage?
Being a multi-billion yen franchise, there are a number of stage shows and plays based on the series. These range in size and complexity from cheaper, stunt-focused shows that are played in malls and festivals to massive, full-scale productions, complete with special effects and original cast members reprising their roles.
What's the next stage?
First and foremost, Kamen Rider exists to sell toys. A lot of them. A lot of them. Rider toys are one of the most common sources for leaks regarding future Riders and plot developments, so people in the fandom tend to keep their eyes on toy catalogs.
What's the next stage?
The drivers that accompany each season are pretty awesome, as I can personally attest to, and they hold up fairly well as long as you take care of them. The trinkets you place into the drivers, on the other hand, they've only got a few years before their batteries start to die and the sounds they make become glitchy and distorted.
What's the next stage?
Being a multi-billion yen franchise, Kamen Rider has quite a few manga based on it, though not as many as you'd think. The Showa Riders had a bunch of manga, a few of which were even done by series creator Shotaro Ishimori. Since then, though, there hasn't been a ton of stuff. There's Kamen Rider Spirits, an Infinity War style crossover between all the Showa Riders, Fudo Detective, which continues the story of Double, the Kuga manga that's a darker reboot like the current Ultraman manga, and a Hong Kong exclusive comic adaptation for Kabuto. So that's weird.
What's the next stage?
When the first images of 01's Kamen Rider Thouser got leaked, there were two versions. One with purple eyes and one with blue eyes. I was there when this went down, and there were two prevailing theories about it. One was that Guy, as Thouser, would have blue eyes, but at some point Hirobi, the purple rider, would get the Thouser driver as a power-up, and the eyes would change to purple to illustrate the difference. The other was that the eye color was related to a 2-in-1 form-style gimmick similar to Gates Revive. Both theories were very wrong. Thouser only has one form and has only ever been depicted with purple eyes. So, where did Blue-Eyed Thouser come from? Well, he was either a fan edit, a trick of the light, or more than likely just an early design that got changed before filming.
What's the next stage?
Shocker is the main antagonistic group from the original series back in the 70s. Shocker is never explicitly stated to be a Nazi group, but they use a lot of Nazi imagery. Their founder has Nazi ties, and, well, one storyline has them working with an actual Nazi to find buried Nazi treasure. So yeah, they're Nazis. Also, Starfish Hitler's a thing, but he's technically not a Shocker creation.
What's the next stage?
Kamen Rider X-Aid, the 2016 to 2017 season, is this weird, off-the-wall mashup of a medical drama and G4 TV that works way better than it has any right to. The writers in this season transform using video games that are each a pastiche of a popular video game genre. The titular X-Aid uses the game Mighty Action X, a Mario-esque platformer. To promote the series, Toei actually created a playable version of Mighty Action X for the 3DS, which came packaged in with the 3DS game Rider Revolution. I obviously haven't played it, but the fact that it even exists is pretty cool.
What's the next stage?
I'll get into this more in a bit, but Hibiki isn't like most Rider seasons. As for the reason why it's not like most Rider seasons, people tend to point to the often repeated idea that Hibiki wasn't initially supposed to be a Rider show, but was turned into one later down the line. This is mostly true, but also more complicated than it appears on the surface. Hibiki was not a Rider show during early pre-production. It was instead a modern reimagining of another Shotaro Ishimori show called Henshin Ninja Arashi. Later on, but critically still in early pre-production, Toei decided to make it a Rider show for branding purposes. So, yes, Hibiki was not initially a Rider show, but the change happened so early in production that it's basically a moot point. Funnily enough, this has almost nothing to do with... So, this is where things get complicated. So complicated that this part of the script is 3 paragraphs long. Ever since Kuga revived, the series in 2000, the franchise had been trending toward a darker, distinctly sci-fi bent, with Faiz in particular being borderline cyberpunk. Hibiki, meanwhile, was a lighter and softer, slice-of-life affair with a focus on Japanese mysticism and folklore. It was a coming-of-age story in which the main rider wasn't really the protagonist. Most of the fights took place in forests against large, and expensive, CG monsters. The main rider didn't transform with a belt. Oh, and there were musical numbers too. Yeah, that was weird. On almost every level, Hibiki was a very different kind of Rider show. And whether it was because the show was so different, or whether it was due to the declining popularity of the franchise as a whole around that time, Hibiki wasn't selling toys, which is what Toei really cares about. So, halfway through the show, the lead producer and lead writer were both replaced, and the new guys awkwardly tried to rework Hibiki into a more traditional season. More fights took place in the city, the unique stylistic elements were dropped, the main kid got an edgy rival, several characters just flat out vanished. It was a mess. The production of Hibiki's second half is a dumpster fire of epic proportions, which culminated in a final episode that was being rewritten as it was filmed. It was so bad that Hibiki's actor publicly slammed Toei for their decisions, which is a really big deal in Japan. It's been years now, but the scars of Hibiki remain. Hibiki's deviations from the formula have never again been replicated in a main series, and compared to other Heisei riders, Hibiki doesn't get as much attention from Toei. Hibiki did get a nice send-off in Decade, though, so I suppose that's something. Being a multi-billion yen franchise, are you tired of this joke yet? Kamen Rider has quite a few novels based on it. The novels are notable for 2 things. 1, being unnecessarily dark and edgy, and 2, not being very well liked because they're unnecessarily dark and edgy. Some highlights from the novels include Emu from X8 being revealed to be an emotional mess who just pretends to be happy due to parental neglect, Ghost dying young just so that he can change the DNA of the woman he loves because it turns out she's a clone of his mom, the surviving cast of Faiz getting raped, murdered, or raped and murdered, Uja being born prematurely into a toilet, eating the feces in said toilet to survive, and then crawling back into his mother's womb through her mouth. This is canon now.
What's the next stage?
Aruto Hiden is the main character of Kamen Rider 01, a show about people interacting with humanoid robots called Humagears. Almost immediately, a lot of people theorized that Aruto himself was a super advanced Humagear that was indistinguishable from humans. There wasn't a ton of evidence in the show itself to support this theory, but considering the franchise's long-running theme of heroes and villains having the same power, and the show's lead writer having pulled a similar twist in X8, there was some validity to the idea. But as of this recording, there are only about 5 episodes left in 01, and there's been no references to Aruto being a Humagear at all, so it's safe to say this theory is debunked.
What's the next stage?
I don't know why this is so low on the iceberg. It only makes sense that not every form and concept will get used. Most of these can be found in the previously mentioned art books.
What's the next stage?
This is a really general topic that could mean any number of things. It could be referring to all the gay ships, which is normal for any fandom. It could be referring to Guy and Raya having a homosexual relationship in Rider Time Ryuki. Except not, because Guy was just a psychopathic murderer who was taking advantage of an amnesiac Raya, and that is a whole other can of worms we're not going to get into here. It could refer to Bravo, who, while not officially confirmed to be gay as far as I can tell, embodies a lot of gay stereotypes. Or maybe it's a reference to the fact that Blade's actor was in a gay porn that one time.
What's the next stage?
The confusingly named Kamen Rider Battle Ganban Rising is a Rider-themed arcade game in which you use collectible cards to summon riders into battle against other riders. It's basically a gacha mobile game with extra steps. I have no idea what this every copy is personalized thing is about, but judging from Reddit comments, it seems to be a reference to a Mario 64 creepypasta, which means we've come full circle in a way.
What's the next stage?
Kamen Rider, like all major media franchises, has porn based on it. It's not that weird. Also, this may be another reference to Blade's actor being in a gay porn that one time.
What's the next stage?
Okay, so here's just some trivia I think should have been on the iceberg, but wasn't for some reason. The idea for Kamen Rider originated from another Ishimori manga called The Skull Man, a much darker story about psychic powers and revenge. Skull Man would later go on to get a very loose, and in my opinion fairly bad, anime adaptation that had a ton of references to Rider and a strong connection to yet another Ishimori creation, Cyborg 009. Yeah, this guy got around. Ryuki was originally going to have a new Rider every episode, but it was scaled back to 13 for budget reasons. Sometime in the 2000s, the actor who played Super 1 asked fans to send money to him, as the Yakuza had stolen his belt and were holding it ransom. Turns out, though, the Yakuza never did that, and the guy vanished not long after. Either he took the money and ran, or the Yakuza killed him for lying. Kabuto and Decade actually have English dubs, but they were never broadcast in America, instead being made for Hong Kong and the Philippines respectively. They're...
What an outfit!
What are you doing here? As a member of Sect?
Zed?
Come.
something. There exist two Western adaptations of the series, Saban's Masked Rider and Kamen Rider Dragon Knight. Dragon Knight has a novel. Yes, this is real. O's initially had a darker ending, but it was changed in response to the 2011 tsunami. Kamen Rider Super Deformed is a thing that exists. Around the time Power Rangers Samurai was coming out, Saban, the rights holder at the time, trademarked the name Power Rider, which could only mean Saban was going to take another crack at adapting the franchise. For better or worse, though, nothing came of the trademark, and it eventually expired in 2014. So in Taiwan, there were these movies called Super Riders. They were basically Taiwanese Power Rangers, intercutting Toei's fight footage with original scenes featuring their own actors. One of these movies would later be redubbed in German and given the infinitely better name of Frankenstein's Kung Fu Monster. And honestly, we were robbed. Ryuki's opening starts down.